Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is now session 5 of our reading group for George Bataille's The Accursed Share, Volume 3, Sovereignty. And I've titled this one The Negative Sovereignty of Communism and the Unequal Humanity of Men, because that's what Bataille titled it. I forgot. So basically, what we did today, we set the reading of all of the part 3 in this volume. So just pages 329 to 364. And for the secondary, just to continue with the thread from last time of essentially trying to give some sort of historical background, ideological coherency to what Bataille is talking about, because Bataille is talking about the question and the meaning of communism as he understands it particularly the Stalinist era of the Soviet Union. It's going to we assign the Soviet Constitution of 1936, which is particularly chapter 10, because it has its elements of the rights of man, the very formal equalities presented in that constitution, and many of the ways in which you could probably see a quite interesting parallel between sort of liberal universalisms or bourgeois universalisms and those of Stalinism in the late 30s. Also, it's hard to not read them about some irony, for example, the freedom of the press, the inviolability of the private home. It's hard to read this without laughing to some extent, even though it is quite a revolutionary text in what it gives you, at least in terms of welfare provisions. But we're continuing Bataille's trying to understand the notion of communism for this idea we saw before of renounced sovereignty. Communism takes its stand to value the human, much like Marx and Feuerbach, the non-alienated human, and in non-alienation, we're all going to essentially eliminate the distance between ourselves and the sacred, or ourselves and even hierarchy or social distinction or difference generally, in the name of a generalized, socialized utilitarianism on behalf of the proletariat, and of course, and under the direction of the Communist Party with Stalin at the head. So, but what we're going to think about here in terms of the negative sovereignty is going to essentially be how Bataille wants to think about the suppression of sovereignty in the Soviet Union and the sovereign suppression of sovereignty in the Soviet Union, particularly through the way in which communism thinks of the human, the way in which it tries to suppress what for Bataille is the anthropological um, core of humanity, which is sovereignty, taboo, distinction, rank. Imagine, even want to think of something like Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor, sort of mystery, majesty, and authority, and how these things are suppressed, even at least in the subjective dimension in Soviet communism, in favor of their objectification in utile forms of calculation, be it in terms of measurements of productive forces, as well as in objective forms of power manifest in the Communist Party, which, as Bataille wants to point out, is structured actually on an early form of sovereignty, that of a military organization, mass mobilization of all the productive forces of society. Now, a lot of this is somewhat repetitive in terms of there's a lot of these, because it's of course still notes, and we're going back to essentially a lot of the earlier themes of particularly volume 2 of the essence of sovereignty, of the anthropological dialectic by which the human becomes separated from the animal in creating that distinction, and then also creating laws around it, such that when one transgresses the law, one is denounced as returning to a kind of animality. But this return is precisely the kind of moment which only humans can do. Only they can break the laws which return them to animality, but the animality that they return to through sort of a kind of transgressive violence is never quite the same. And so we see a lot of returns of the themes, the main themes here. We can see this, for example, in the section on part 2 of this of our reading, sort of around sort of 340, 343, called On the Relationship Between Human Dignity and Prohibition, this association with transgression. And he returns really to a lot of the key things we've even been seeing since Bataillean context, which, for example, the notion of the king. So there's a quote: "The kings and priests observe rules stricter than others, but these rules derive from their nature. They are rules that derive from a fundamental transgression of the rule. Hence, the establishment of a transgression produces a law, produces a kind of sovereignty that can sort of be the site of this transgression and represent its social power, not only in the objective sense, form of institutions, but in the subjective sense as well, in how people see themselves through their social the social conditions, their social subjection, the way in which power starts to shape our subjectivities as members of a community. But let's just go back to communism just quickly here. Bataille's critique of communism here, or at least description of it, I don't know if it's necessarily a critique, is it's relatively Orwellian, to use a sort of literary term. It's very Orwellian. So we all become equal, but some people are more equal than others. We can't quite say that. We look from pig to man and man to pig, and we can never tell the difference between it. It's a little bit cringeworthy to read it, isn't it? It's kind of like, yeah, we heard this before. I mean, this is the most detailed version we've ever heard. To be fair to Bataille, he's not just pulling an Orwell here and saying, they wanted equality, but no, but he's actually taken us seriously as this is a new mode of being which has been achieved. This is not him saying, he's not trying to point at a liberal contradiction in communism as a practice. He sees it as a real advance. He sees it as a real force in human history, and he identifies it with Stalinism, as many communists did and still do. I mean, he's writing at the time of, well, he mentions it. Beria's execution is not far from us. So he's writing after Beria's executed. He's writing after Stalin's death, and therefore he's writing after when Malakov was the secret speech, the denunciations of Stalin, and the real shattering of communist consciousness, particularly throughout the West. And we know, it, there's a great novel about this, Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, and sort of the real sort of psychic shock of realizing what Stalinism was doing, what people's investment in that figure ended up giving them, which wasn't very much. But if we want to think about this undifferentiated sovereignty, this non-sovereignty, this undifferentiation of valuing humans only insofar as they're sort of taken in terms of utile calculations, in terms of their productivity, in terms of their um, the immediacy, universality of their working classness. This is really going to be sort of the standard that Ty is talking about, because it can be this huge repression of sovereignty, and we see this a little bit in the first part, equivalence and distinction. For example, he talks about the luxury of certain kinds of thought, and in ways of the very good arguments that he sees communism as having against kind of the luxuries of, for example, nihilism or or the luxury of art, for example. There's a quote from 331. Isn't the generosity of the communistic intellectuals and bourgeois preferable to the avarice of the conservatives? Do those goods that make life worth living for both these groups deserve to be defended? When the voice of a throng condemned to the labor of the mines makes itself heard, what importance does the protest of a negligible refinement and a morbid sensitivity have? And in many ways, he's talking about himself here. What grounds could he have to speak against the whole, the organic unity of a class empowered for itself? Because indeed, he believes that communism is what he says it is. He thinks this is an actual power, but he has problems with it. Of course, the problems with it being that in its sort of elimination or effacing of social difference, it's eliminating sovereignty in a sovereign way, but it can't be fully conscious of it. This is why I think that as we're going to see next month, the next section is going to be the literary world and communism, because communism for Bataille infinitely defers things to the end of the 5-year plan, to utile ends beyond the immediacy of the moment. He thinks it's just as obsessed with accumulation as capitalism is, and yet it completely eliminates the subjective element, which is still there in capitalism, but it's very, well, it's bourgeois. It's all about what things you own. It's all about divisions of rank expressed in. It's really like a lot about. It's like very much like the opening of the film Fight Club, when Tyler Durden is obsessed about his IKEA furniture. This is kind of the subjectivity Bataille is talking about here. The reduction of subjectivity to its relationship to the world of things, as opposed to any sort of great acts in which things are destroyed, like potlatches or festivals. It's all about possessions, fixing coordinates of ownership around you, and of commodities around you. And this is something that Bataille, this communist exopathy is not going to escape, which is why it has to be constantly mobilized to produce more things. It's something to be satisfied with the things it has. This is why it's manifest in the form of a military power, particularly the military power of the Communist Party. Hence why Bataille says, and this is a great quote, that communist activity is a battle. So I'm just going to sort of park it there in terms of sort of any sort of main thoughts, just giving some rudimentary summaries here. I just want to ask sort of questions moving forward is, I mean, one, are we convinced by what Bataille thinks communism is? I mean, but two, is this repression of sovereignty, is this a new development in what Bataille is talking through us so far? Why do we think that after he's going to turn to the literary world and Nietzsche to sort of reinvent the subjective element here? Because insofar as he thinks communism has become a progressive movement, or at least in terms, it's moving forward through something. It's a new development in sovereignty. Because before, humans never denied sovereignty en masse. Does this empower us for a new kind of sovereignty now that we've made, power so objective? Does the objectivity of power leave open a new space for a new kind of sovereign subjectivity now that sovereignty has been emptied out into the world? I guess that's the question for moving forward. Anyone just go for it?
I guess I guess I'll just ask for clarification, and maybe this responds also to what you have said. I'm still thinking about what subjectivity is at this point in Bataille's argument, because it's very clear that it's this subjectivity. I mean, a big part of his critique of communism seems to also be around the self-deception that is embedded in it, that it is absolutely about a kind of set of values that does not acknowledge the distinctions, assumes the equality of its own or the absoluteness of its own ideals, right? And the first part is to belie that there are actually all these distinctions at play that allow this to be in place. So self-deception seems to be a part of his, seems to be a critique, although is not a term that Bataille uses. But moving from there then is this question around, okay, so if we move away from the communist model, that equality is preserved precisely because of the assumption, production, reproduction of certain kinds of social relations, right? Assumptions that become social relations. Then the opposite of that might be, it feels like instead of creation, it might be destruction, which is, but is it a destruction of the social relations? And if so, is that a subjectivity that is tied to individuality or not? Like, and this is where I'm feeling like maybe someone like Nietzsche is going to become important for, because there the question is, these questions of destroying or challenging or the world as it creates us become tied to a self that is really at least perceptible in my reading at the individual level. So I'm just not sure if I'm quite getting that here, is like, what is the social subject in Bataille's work? I think I know it's the individual in Nietzsche's work, but I don't know if that's the case here. And that's where it rubs up against then, what kind of a challenge to communism is this for me? In terms of challenging the notion of a social subject who comes into being through relations with others.
Yeah, I'll hop in really quick.
Yeah.
Because I had a similar something triggered a similar question for me on 342, where I think one of the first times he's really explicitly said, like defined, for instance, the word human. He says, hence the word human never denotes, as simple-minded people might imagine, a stabilized position, but rather an apparently precarious equilibrium that distinguishes the human quality.
Yeah.
And that was the closest thing I've seen. That was the closest thing I've seen him say something very explicit about that. But I'm curious how, and I'm going to reread the following section after I stop talking, but like how he links that into what you're bringing up, which is this this destruction of social relations. What happens there? But I just wanted to flag that. I thought that was a helpful quote for me. Chris, go for it, please.
We have raced really, really quickly into the stuff that I found most difficult to think about. So the question of subjectivity is something that I had, especially through the second chapter, and the stuff that I connected it to. And this has happened to me before when we've read since the Hegel session that we did. When Bataille talks about subject and object, I think about that Kojèvian Hegelianism, where the subject appears in, was it the knight, is it, meets the retainer and subjectifies and risks their life, and in that contest sort of becomes subject. I'm doing a terrible job of remembering this, but there's something in that Kojèvian Hegel about subjects risking something, maybe themselves, in making objects of other things or other people and gaining that recognition. And I think that that's one of the reasons why de Sade recurs throughout this, because de Sade is an example of that taken to extreme, like a subject who would risk themselves to the point of self-annihilation by making objects of others. And I wonder if some of this criticism of communism that Bataille has is that actually he's been more explicit in other places about the equality of individuals. If we say everyone's equal, then we can't exploit others. In fact, isn't it in the Constitution that we read, that little chapter, there's something about nobody being allowed to be exploited. Perhaps is there something about if there's no differentiation, does it remove or deny the possibility of somebody experiencing that kind of subjectification?
Adam, I know you wanted to. Adam, you should follow up up here.
Yeah, I mean the stuff about so just to start with what Chris talking about the Hegel. Yeah, I think the best place to turn to this would be Hegel, and particularly the Kojèvian Hegel, because the subject for at least we saw it arises from subjection and is essentially kind of at least in terms of how Bataille is also spoken about as well, the subjectivity of someone is sort of reflected. In some senses, their subjectivity socially is reflected back for them through the dominant kind of sovereignty. The king beams back to you your subjection because you are a subject of the king, because the king does something glorious, and they become like their subjectivity kind of becomes like a stand-in for yours in a kind of sympathetic or mimetic imagination. But just generally going back to that point about the human being sort of the one that refuses the given, being sort of in the midst of a storm. This refusal of the given, as in just any given object, refusal of what is immediately presented, is going to be the human quality for Bataille for the same reasons the human quality for Kojève in his reading of Hegel. It's essentially because in order for something to be an object for a subject, it kind of needs to object to the subjects trying to grasping it to some extent. It has to be a blockage of some. It has to be an obstacle. Take it to the German like Gegenstand, literally standing against. And so our subjectivity in this sort of very German idealist mode is always reflected back to us through kind of obstacles to just the pure immediate streams of consciousness. Refusing or negating the given is essentially a way of setting a limit to what's constantly flowing into your field of experience such that you can sort of reflect upon it. Which is why it's, subjection for Kojève has to go through this, there's master-servant dialectic when you have to sort of mediate objects rather than simply purely receiving them. If you purely receive them, the subjective capacity isn't doing any work there. As we figured out with Hegel, every object is only an object because it's an object for a subject. Otherwise, it's just an object without anything experiencing or knowing it. And so this question of subjectivity here, when he describes it as being like through a storm, I just think it's quite fascinating, partly because it makes the human a kind of anthropological like meta stability. doesn't mean that the human to be a human subject in yourself is to have that kind of capacity. To be a human subject for yourself is to be subjected. So, to have power exercised upon you in a kind of subjection, which is also the power to say no to the given, because otherwise there's nothing really stopping that constant flow of experience. There's no need to be conscious of it in a sense, because in order to be self-conscious, to be reflexive, what's pushing you back into yourself such that that experience becomes possible. But I hate to think about it really, because the setting of limits is always going to be the anthropological or the anthropogenetic thing for Bataille. But this setting of limits essentially means that we encounter them as limits, and therefore are pushed back into ourselves to some extent.
Briefly, so on page, there's a move here. He's talking about value, right? And then he's talking about on page 336 and 337. There's an interesting quote. No one can deny it. The respect due to man is meaningful only insofar as I remain associated with the impulse that led men of all times to contest the humanity of all the others. And then I'm reading Hegel's on the side right now. So unfortunately, I'm putting this quote in here, where Hegel, in this screenshot that I just sent, is doing this move where he's justifying slavery. And I'm trying to connect these two threads and reading them at once. And there's this move here, like Hegel is basically saying, if you weren't worthy of being a slave, you'd have killed yourself already. And Bataille is interrogating this, not this, but there's something Bataille's investigating here where it's like, and I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but it's how he puts it is the curse of man by man, which is interesting. That even though that we're doomed to just oppress each other, and that's what makes us great. And it is like this problematic, not problematic, this tension he's dealing with. And there's Hegel written all over this, and I'm not sure how. And I'm struggling to articulate it, but there's this annoying question of value that we come to as well that we'll have to talk about, that I'm not sure what to do about myself. That plays a lot in here. John, go for it.
Well, I think that to go back to the original comment, I mean, all people see themselves as subjects. I mean, each individual sees themselves as a subject. The issue is, do others see others as subjects? And to go to Chris's point, Hegel's notion is you don't fully appreciate or understand your subjectivity, yourself as a distinct entity, until you've risked your life for something, until you've pushed yourself to that ultimate extreme. And when you've done that, you have the full experience of your own subjectivity. And then the issue comes down: do you see others as subjects or objects? I mean, that's my fundamental. What I believe is the fundamental point of de Sade says everything in this world is an object of my desire. There is no other subject other than the I, and I can do whatever I want because everything is an object. I'm not inflicting pain because I enjoy watching that. I enjoy the pain that person suffer. I'm subjecting that object to pain because that's what I want to do. I don't care about them. I think where Bataille is going to here is, as subjects, we all want to see ourselves as distinct and unique or different in some way, or society wants to draw distinctions. It's the basic notion of a democracy. The fundamental flaw of democracy is democracy treats all equal people equally and all unequal people unequally. So who is the equal and who is the unequal? And the unequal on the upper level that we've seen reading through the rest of Bataille was almost symbolically or spiritually based. Your distinction from your fellow members of society was where you were born, who you were born to, the rank you were given, or something along some nebulous, undefined mechanism. So you couldn't say, how am I different than this person? Once you get to capitalism, people are still looking for that way to distinguish themselves. Why am I more unique and important than my neighbor? And that comes in what we're told in capitalism: buy your things. And that goes all the way back to Hegel, who says you are the property you own. And so if I have more property, then I have more subjective importance than anyone else. When we get to communism, what's interesting about communism is what he's doing, what I believe Bataille is doing here is we're looking at things in a purely materialistic way. And I think it's important because I think we get this early in the discussions of communism by Bataille, is that no one would ever say that the Soviet Union in the 20s, 30s, or the 30s, 40s, and 50s was yet a communist country. We were going to work collectively to bring us, because we were a feudal system, we needed to bring ourselves through the industrial, through industrialization, through all of this stuff, because we had this utopian goal of reaching a communist state. And the problem you have then with Stalin, and I think the problem that's being raised here is that Stalin did not see the human or the members of the society as subjects. They were objects. They, in the sense that he could not understand how they did not think like him. It's like rather than accumulating today, we're going to collectively work for a better for all in the future, and you should all want to do that because you're simply objects. You have no distinction over my view of what the correct normative notion of a society should be. So we should all collectively work for this, and those who don't are inferior and they need to be expended, because this is the best source of where we're going to, I am making a determination as to this is the best way to order society. And since you lack the level of subjectivity that I have, I'm superior to you, you will follow me, and this will end up to be a better way of society. And so I think Bataille is ultimately saying that may not make sense either, because there's the fundamental problem you have with communism is communism doesn't work if the people don't want it. You first have to engage the people to say, yes, I share that utopian dream. Because my version of sovereignty has always been the people are sovereign. I mean, the people ultimately determine how they're going to be governed. I mean, look at the United States. You've got a couple thousand people that are the federal government and 350 million people who are under the thumb of that government. Those 350 million people tomorrow could say no, they don't. And you're going back to what we talked about last time, which is, the Hobbes notion of the social contract and how we have such problems with that. I think the better answer is what Hume says. What Hume says is, no, we are stuck in habit. And what Stalin was looking to do with communism is get the people to think this is the way society is going to exist. So we are freely going to exist, freely accepting to exist in this society. And then maybe the government will get it to a better place, but everyone's simply conforming their actions. And it goes back to the Mark Fisher's point of capitalist realism is we cannot see things differently. We may have been conquered. Almost every country in the world was conquered by a foreign force. There was no social contract there. They didn't agree to have that person as their government. But look, 50 years later, and 50 years later, their government is their brother because they've fallen into that habit. So I think when he gets to communism, he's basically taking this to an end and saying, does this system of subjectivity and objectivity work? And I think in the end, he's saying, no, it's not working.
I'm just going to briefly say something, John. You've kind of triggered some thoughts for me, and that, because I was going back through the document. He talks a lot of he brings back, as kind of Adam alluded to, the questions of rank, and it's talking about things like aesthetic judgments of people and their proximity to animality, or poor people being disgusting, things of that nature. And then I remembered what really struck me on 338. The cause of this desire to be more human than others, and then you can condemn others that are not human enough. And he's identified a recurring strategy throughout a lot of schools of thought that I've been running into as well, which is that of damnation. How do you damn others? How do you justify others into things like slavery, or to things like lower classes? And so this is the thing that the medieval church is doing. This is the thing that Hegel's doing. This is the thing that Roman law is justifying with questions of free will and responsibility. And this language of damnation here is kind of coming out in Bataille, and has he talked about humans wanting to condemn others before? I forget if he's like explicitly said it like that. And there's this question of sadism, as you brought up, John, too, in here somehow. Like how easily can we flip into a sadistic mode of thought about that, perhaps, or something? But just some language I wanted to introduce into thinking about it, which is damnation.
Just quickly, no, the thing that you've said, I don't recall ever having come across this condemning or damnation, but on 337, it says the principle of equivalence is contrary to the essence of a species constituted in the ceaseless exclusion, in the malediction of that which is placed lower than the state it had reached. And that exclusion, we've seen right from Bataille context, that the sacred and the profane, what we include, what we exclude, is what makes that, and how things cross those boundaries as well. That exclusion definitely has been something right from the start we've seen.
Yeah, good observation. And that's what the function of a lot of how we operate and deal with waste and excess is, sort of this continuing we-they distinction, a series of relays, a series of inclusion, exclusion for class and whatnot and so forth. So that's interesting. And he's saying, and if I'm getting this right, in communism, that's not necessarily happening in the same way, right? There's a different process going on. We don't have culture anymore in communism. We just have value and work and freedom of that.
But you can trace the damnation all the way back to Lutheranism. The whole notion that, we have original sin, we're going to be judged by our work. Our work's never going to make us fully successful because our reward's going to come in the future. So we freely accept. And that's what you had previously. You go back to the feudal world, the serfs did not see themselves as having the mobility to rise up to any other level because that was God's will. And as you go forward, we're getting rid of, even with Lutheranism, you still have, it's God's will. We are sinners. We are in this state. And then when you have communism, you've thrown out all the mysticism of that. But still, it's not, I don't think it's necessarily damnation. I think it's this notion that you're told you are not capable. It's still, you're not capable of making those decisions. You need Stalin, you need the father to make those decisions. And how is that fundamentally different than fascism? Because you have the distinction between tyranny, between an autocratic government and a fascist government, is that the people share, in a fascist government, the people share the vision of the leader. They think what the leader is doing is right, that we are, and that's what Stalin's communism was doing. I have the right plan. And then going all the way down the ranks, all the way down to the most oppressed person there, they said, yeah, Father Stalin is right. As opposed to, something like you have in an autocratic country, which is, no, my leader is a complete jerk, but if I do anything, he's going to shoot me. And that's where again, it comes down to habit, that you've convinced the people that they are damned and they accept their damnation. It's not imposed on them. And that's why when you get to the end of Bataille, Bataille says the individual is sovereign. But I think he makes the error where he should be saying is people are sovereign, because people collectively choose their fate.
Just to come very quickly back to damnation and exclusion, it just occurred to me that we're reading the Accursed Share, and in French, I don't speak French, this is Google, maudit is cursed or damned. And I guess that Bataille's criticism of both bourgeois capitalism and Soviet communism is that they're both seeking to like get rid of any accursed share, any excess, because in both, any extra is reinvested, like always attempted to be made useful. The development of the means of production in Soviet Union and the same but different in capitalism. There's definitely differences in his critique of those things, but both want to deny or do away with this damned excess.
Just really quick follow-up on that. It's interesting that just as the excess energy in Bataille's view is cursed, or not cursed, is what we want to, there's systems that want to get rid of that or deal with that. And it's like seen as bad, drinking or whatever. The slave who is damned and is seen as worthless is also at the same time integral to the economy and the project of empire, and just as the waste is in the sense of sacrifice, which is interesting. Yeah.
Just to go again, the very briefly, while I was thinking through the previous, there's something that Adam said months and months ago, and it's something along the lines of, if you don't know what the accursed share is, it's probably you, like the worker in that exploited system.
Oh, okay. All right. That does sound like something I said, but yeah.
Adam, you're not picking. I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, it's a problem with equipment like this. I can never afford to tell what part's broken. Right. Okay. What I think a lot of the things we're sort of circling around here is really the question of judgment, and essentially judgment in the formal sense. One, can we say, well, even the judgment of good and bad, but judgment at least in the faculty of making a distinction and then placing objects of experience under them. So there's a few good quotes to support this. Around 334. So there's, for example, we have here just at the middle of 334, just before section 4, the morals implicit in communism are connected from the start with the principle of leaving the value judgments are tied to these gradations in the background. These gradations referring to essentially better or worse kinds of being human. The formal equivalence of all humans basically eliminates the capacity to make judgments of better or worse. That's kind of his main argument here. And then if you go a bit further down the same page, external to different material interests, the immediate judgment that decides about the relative humanity of an individual, a social level, or a people, usually adapts itself to those interests. This is what leads Marxists, with apparent good reason, to deny the sense of the judgment. This judgment is brought to bear, in fact, from the top to the bottom, hitting the oppressed classes or races and also operating at the lowest rung. The bourgeois are not the only ones to regard blacks as an inferior form of humanity, less removed from the whites than the whites from animality. But the secondary prohibition falls on these immediate reactions. There is no question that primary prohibitions concerning the races have had the most inhuman consequences. On the more or less human scale, nothing is more animal than Auschwitz. And so what Bataille is talking about in terms of judgment is basically the conditions of possibility for us making moral judgments, which requires us to make distinctions. And for Bataille, he thinks like the sort of the Stalinist Marxist approach has completely evacuated elements of, for example, the sacred or the glorious, but which essentially set the standard and which allow us to think about what transgresses, what exceeds good humanity and leads us to bad humanity, or instead makes a sovereign humanity which we must revere but can't stick around with for a while. Hence, why the king must die. Hence why he's kind of, the queen is kind of quarantined off from the rest of the world as kind of the principle of the world. It also, there's a social order in it, also its kind of secret shame. And I think to think about judgment here, the conditions of possibility of making no distinction, I think that's one of the critiques but Bataille is going to bring forth. It's a Nietzschean one, because what is the value of man when man is reduced to pure utilitarianism, pure natural need and pure natural productivity, as opposed to the very excess of given immediate nature, which is what Bataille thinks makes us human. And what same thing for Hegel as well, if you want to read him anthropologically. And this is why Hegel is so awful on slavery, because he thinks that, you have to be dragged out of your immediacy and negated in order to become, to get to, as John was saying, to grasp habits, to get second nature. Second nature requires that the first nature has to be suppressed in some way, or limits be set to it, such that you can pass through those limits, and on the other side of it, cultivate a secondary self, a secondary nature, literal second nature. And that's why Hegel does think slavery is good, because it brings people out of themselves, and it's the same reason he thinks war is good, because it brings you entitled, immediate consciousnesses out of your avocado toast and into the realm of self-consciousness. Hegel sounds like a Daily Mail opinion columnist, because he is one. I mean, and let's be honest, Bataille says something very similar later down the line. He says war brings the bourgeois out of themselves, out of an immediate concern for things. And so the conditions of judgment here, the conditions of valuation, Bataille thinks that communism's great achievement here seems to be that they've evacuated all of those aspects of valuation by introducing this formal human equivalence.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they're still making them. So how, what sort of new values are we going to need to make? What sort of new practices of valuation, and therefore of, in a way, ranking better or worse forms of being alive, will have to come in for this? And, is that Nietzsche's music? And that's why he's going to come in for this. I should go for it.
Okay, so I still think to respond to all of the conversation so far, there's a knot in Bataille's own thinking that constantly he unweaves and reknots, because part of the problem I feel structurally might be that as a diagnostic of the problem of communism, this is absolutely, like, I don't think there's a way to argue against the way he is belying the kind of facade that the notion of equality is based upon, right? That it has all of these distinctions in the communist model. However, because his own transgression doesn't, for Bataille, emerge in a vacuum. It is transgressive of something called capitalism, something called bourgeois kind of subjectivity. It's a particular kind of subjection against which he continues to argue. We're going to have a situation, it seems to me, where he cannot get out of the bind of that exact critique is also going to continue to determine his own, he is going to set up. So transgression, as much as it seems like, oh, transgression is like anything. Someone's telling me I can't, I won't. But it's not, that's why I ask, is every kind of transgression the appropriate kind of excess for him? Because he's saying something that is actually also only contains a stability because it's set up through a kind of binary opposition, communism, capitalism, and somehow he thinks both of them are problematic, and there's somehow transgression is the modality that's going to interject it. But it's also that capitalism continues to be against capitalist values and against a kind of bourgeois subjectivity that is, I think, tied to sexual repression. All of this stuff like somehow comes under that banner that he also is like, he's not free of it, right? He's not free of morality, and he's not free of this same limit that he's pushing. So what that means, what I want to raise then is that that subjectivity, he has an argument against subjectivity because of its subjection. And yet, because subjection is always going to be the effect of an ideological situation, he doesn't get out of that, because he cannot get out of that bind that responds to, like, there's not an annihilation necessarily of, there's an annihilation perhaps of capitalism, but in its place, what is the thing that is being created? And that's why I come back to, like, what is this as a sociality, unless, if it's not about the individual and it's not about the self, and this is, otherwise, it's closer to a kind of Stirner, if it's not, but if it is moving in the direction of Nietzsche, then I think Nietzsche also presents the same kinds of ironies. Particularly if we do the reading that Deleuze has of Nietzsche, the recuperative one, then we get the same kinds of binds. I'm sorry, I'm going on, because I also think what I want to say is that transgression then is already, he needs to do, like, he's dead, but he needs to come back and do an analysis of his own concept of transgression and the legs on which it stands, because it is subjective. It's already subjected by a certain kind of ideological sense. And I still maintain at the end of this that I don't know what, because it can't just be an argument against subjectivity, not the way that he has structured this, especially around the response against. Look at the conversation around the king. The problem of the king, it feels like, is that he has the special power to transgress, but Bataille is totally for this transgression, right? He just is the argument that we all deserve that self-sovereignty, and not necessarily. The problem there is that that's the argument he's making there, is that the king creates that special power for themselves through this kind of distinction. But he can't possibly, he wants transgression. So what is he carrying of that same dynamic into the concept of the subject that he's giving us, right? And does communism really leave no space for any subjectivity? Isn't there some sense in which there's a shared values that people have as an ethical framework? And sure, that can be determinative, but isn't the reading just too complete here, that as if we have no distinction if we have communism? Like I can't believe that's true, that all of our subjectivity dies in whole, Sorry.
Yeah, I think that what he is pushing against is the transgression that we're told is a transgression. And he's saying, from in the Sadian sense, you need to identify your own transgression. And we've seen that throughout what he's saying, is that, and if you read just the last few paragraphs of it, I think it clears up a lot of what he's saying, and I can look at it in a second. In that we need to identify our own sovereignty in very much the Stirner sense. By saying we're a communist, by saying we're a capitalist, by saying all of these things and adopting their notions of what is value, what is power, what is transgression, you are denying yourself your own humanity. You need to divine it for yourself. Because what he says, I guess in the last paragraph, whether it's a matter of communism or in general of humanity, the agitation in question in which sovereignty is involved is at the same time so strong and so obscure that experiencing it, we lose what little lucidity, what little wisdom we have. Conversely, all values get mixed up in, particularly if we consider communism, which has raised objections to those things that men previously held as sacred. So what he's saying is, we've realized all of these problems coming up through here when you had the tribe, the tribal notions of the sacred, the ritual, all of those things. Then we had the collection of things, and that didn't work. Now we're having communism where we're going to be purely materialist. We're going to get purely materialistic in that there is no sacred, but the collection of things is not good. And he says in all of these systems of organization of humanity, we've lost our humanity. We've lost who we are. And I don't think he has an answer in how we find that subjectivity, because we have a basic problem that as subjects, regardless of where we are in status, we so demand to see ourselves as unique and distinct. And we judge our subjectivity against those objects or subjects we see outside ourselves. That's why we all probably would do really well if we were a Sufi, because the Sufis say every time they encounter another person, they simply see God and smile. And that's really where I think he's trying to get to. And I think that's really the sterner point, is all systems of organization, all systems, you get to the accursed shares, that you're creating things that are unneeded. And in creating those things that are unneeded, whether it's through a capitalist system, whether it's through a communist system, you've lost or are losing your humanity. So how do we find the right answer? He doesn't have it. And it's probably that's why he does go to Nietzsche next. I haven't read that part, but I can see why he would go there. But I bet in the end, Nietzsche's not going to give him the right answer either.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful to spend a little bit of time on the transgression as well. I mean, if you want to sum up, I'll start backwards. But I think a lot of Bataille's critique of the Soviets here is, you can sum it up very crudely, because Bataille's notion of transgression is very vulgar, which is essentially everyone in the Soviet Union wants fertilizer, no one wants a shit. It is a constipated society. Now, why am I talking about shit all of a sudden? Because it's Bataille, but everything is about excretion for Bataille. He's a very shit-focused human being. I mean, it's transgression, before it gets into the anthropological dimension, in the Accursed Volume 2, in this volume, it's first and foremost about physics and energetics. It is.
You cut out, Adam, for me.
This fucking thing. All right, so I have no idea why it cuts out. It could be the Focusrite. It could be the microphone. They're both too expensive. I can't afford enough one to test them. Who knows? Right, let's go. Shit. There we go. That's where I was. Bataille, transgression is first and foremost in Accursed Volume 1 energetic. It is the crossing of a boundary. Simultaneity of ingress for entry, egress for exits, and then we have the sound card's fine. It's just everything else. I'll test it one day. I'll test it one day. I'll find another sound. I know enough DJs. I'll find another Focusrite. But the transgression is energetic insofar as things cross over a boundary, insofar as there is too much for them to contain. This is the principle of general economy for Bataille. Energy accumulates, and it accumulates in sort of patterns and pools. And when there's too much energy to grow any further, the accursed share is that which ends up on the other side of it. That which can't be used for growth by an organism is therefore cursed to be wasted, or at least to no longer be used for the productive growth of that organism. And so this is the explosive violence of nature, the solar anus, as you would put it in that text. And of course, there's lots of critique about his notion of violence as being incredibly hyper-masculinized in terms of its models of phallicness and explosivity, which we can see going all the way back to his essay, The Notion of Expenditure. But in terms of the social function, it's going to be the transgression of a law is also going to be this equivalent to taboo. And those laws, because as soon as you create a law, you create the crime. By inventing a crime, you invent law. Sorry, by inventing law, you invent crime. And it's going to be transgression, which is kind of like transgression, much like the energetics of transgression, much like the accursed share, much like the inevitability that you know, everybody poops, and if you don't poop, you die. And then guess what happens when you die? You poop. You can't hold back this exit of matter, of excess matter from the body, which is surplus to growth. That's just it for Bataille. That's if you want to sum up Bataille in 2 words, everybody poops isn't a bad way of going about it, because that is the principle of general economy. If you try and restrict it and hold it in, it's don't worry, the general economy will always win out in the end, because loss is primary, or at least the inevitability, the primary end of everything is not useful. It's not itself purposeful, and therefore not an end in the way in which we humanly talk about ends. And so to think about transgression in terms of its relationship to subjectivity, it's going to be these limits and how we exceed them that make us human, because taboos make us human, because animals don't. Okay, Bataille's wrong about this, but for Bataille, animals don't have taboos. They don't have taboos about, you know, incest or not eating humans or disposing of their shit, which of course most animals do have these prohibitions. But bracketing that out a little bit, the human thing is that sort of distancing from the immediate animal, biological, natural, given conditions of life, which allow us to give them meanings, to think about them in a second term under regimes of language. That kind of abstraction, that's like stepping back, which humans can do from their own immediate natural surroundings. And so for Bataille, in terms of communism, it's going to be that it's going to essentially be that the distinction between human and animality just isn't given its proper historical or weight. It's the history of the technologies of making things sacred, of creating rituals. These have all been sort of cleared away in the great revolutionary negation that is communism, of the entire feudal world and the bourgeois world and all the histories of us making ourselves human for these various practices. And then it's kind of abstract wiping away of all of that. There's not really much for them to do. And so they've kind of taken away the you know, there's that contradiction, because Bataille throughout this chapter is always talking about ladders. You know, if you use ladders to get up, you accept that there's something meaningful about the way you get there. Communism can't quite acknowledge that, because much like Hegel's account of the French Revolution, it's constantly trying to undermine the very ground on which it got there. And it's doing this not for any kind of, you know, destruction of the king in terms of the moment of enjoyment. There's not any festivals. It's mostly about getting satisfaction in the end, in the future, in the realization of communism. And so what's interesting in terms of, I think, do we have subjectivity of the communism? Yeah, but I think we do. It's just it's not something that communism can acknowledge for itself, or at least it can't. It doesn't have the proper tools to do so in the way that actually creates new values beyond that history of the way in which we've done them. Because the creation of value is going to be this Nietzschean problematic. It's going to liberate the imagination, I guess. Insofar, and it doesn't. I don't think it means so much that we have to all become kings so much. I think because sovereignty, much like shitting, is inevitable insofar as they're both connected to uselessness. It's about given that we know these things are inevitable, why don't we try and reconfigure them? If we know, you know, if we know that these processes are always going to come, why are we constantly, you know, pissing against the wind, fighting against trying to hold up the sea? For Bataille, it's me like, well, we can't do that, so we need to modulate this and deal with how much more that we could be doing with it, I guess. Sorry, I went a bit too long. Sorry. Sorry, do you want to respond to that? Sorry,
I just wanted to say one thing, that because, I mean, I think excretion, where you began, is exactly it. Because this is fundamentally grounded in some conception of human that is also tied to animality, but that is because it is tied to that, like, it feels like that's a closeness of the system, that everything we get is just a reconfiguration of power within what he wants to understand as human possibility and human limit, right? So maybe that explains, maybe I don't know if I mean human limit. I'll have to think more about that. But there is a closeness in this system that is so tied to centering of and grounded in a conception of the human that is, his. And I can't imagine that it doesn't give us a Bataillean subjectivity.
Oh yeah, this is limits of the anthropological in general. It's always going to be. I mean, we saw this with Volume 1, with like his sources for his anthropological sort of data. I mean, we were all just kind of collectively embarrassed for him at that point, using stuff like Cahiers du Sud's British imperial investigations of like Tibetan Buddhism. It was atrocious, honestly. But so anyway, sorry, Nate, go for it. Then we got Chris afterwards.
Yeah, so I think that like all of y'all have really been sort of like highlighting this problem, like this huge problem I'm kind of having. I think Bataille kind of gets stuck in because of like sort of the Hegelian like terminology that he's using to look at all of this stuff. With this distinction between like the subject and the object, and his sort of, it's really confusing reading him, I think, because there's so much like polyvocity going on between like his use of, sovereign moments, this experience of the sacred, all of these things that kind of designate this like rapturous excess and sort of release from a kind of dependence on an object. And so when he says something along the lines of like, only the subject, like the subject can be sovereign or whatever, it almost like can't by definition, because to be a subject, you need an object in order to become a subject. And he even says that sovereignty is something in which, one is almost like liberated from time, and time is sort of annulled in the sovereign moment, the experience of the sacred. But also, again, in order to become a subject, this is a process that needs to sort of occur through time. And so I just find all of this very, very confusing to kind of try to grapple with, because at the end of the day, like you said, Adam, I mean, it almost really does kind of get into these like limits of the anthropological, and sort of the limits of what we can do when we're start thinking about, ourselves as subjects and things or whatever as objects, and that something like, a kind of like Deleuzian sort of conception of like singularity, and, this, and like processes of like aesthetic judgment rather than sort of moralistic value or rational discursive judgments, for me, becomes just like really important. And I don't know, I'm struggling with how to sort of make sense of what Bataille's saying here, because, at the end of the day, he really wants that sovereign moment, that moment of sort of rapturous liberation from subjectivity. So I just find that the way that he uses those terms kind of gets me confused, and I think ends up kind of confusing like what he's trying to sort of say as well.
Yeah, you're not alone in thinking this is difficult, Nate. You've put it really, really well there. I was going to say that I completely agree with Aisha's problem with transgression in Bataille, that in giving it such an important place, but never addressing the fact, or not sufficiently addressing the fact, that you need a lawgiver to transgress against, and in using de Sade so often and never addressing the problems in de Sade, he gives us very little to work with, to imagine. Like he's critiquing communism, and we might think there's some fair critiques there, but he's done very little to show us how he might want to do things differently. And in our last session, where he suggested just for a little bit, there was no de Sade, and he suggested just for a little bit that maybe we could sovereignly sacrifice ourselves for a greater project. That was the most interesting bit we've had in a while for me. I was going to do something else. Okay. The other thing that you said, Aisha, about is there really no subjectivity in Soviet communism? This came right from the start. Adam, you asked this question, and I have zero historical knowledge to base this on. But presumably, while the bits of Stalin that we read were very much focused on the development of the means of production, like very, very useful, utile, like we're going to produce more. While that might have been on paper, I'm certain that there must have been peasants in the far-flung reaches of the empire who were still like having festivals in the very typical sort of Bataillean sense of excess. And the other thing, it like comes sort of around the death of Stalin or just following it. But I guess you could do another historical data chapter, maybe without the embarrassing sources for that, but on the Soviet space program or the Soviet nuclear program as well, because what an amazing example of the use to which excess is put. And perhaps that's not great for like subjectivity in the expression of excess, but there are examples of it at least.
I mean, I think we could probably say that Bataille doesn't really have a. He wouldn't have the data for it, to be fair, but he wouldn't have had much of a good sense of the social life of the Soviet Union. I get the critique where he's coming from in terms of they're trying sort of bring it out of nowhere, but even then they're not really. I mean, yeah, of course we had these revolutionary art movements in the 20s. That the various abstraction. I mean, there's actually, if you go on the itch.io, there's a new game out called something like Meet Me in the Workers Club, and it's like a little digital music. It's free. It's just like a digital first person game. You can play it, you can download it for free, and it takes you through the workers clubs movement, and you get to see like the designs of the various designers, these workers clubs that still exist throughout Russia and the former Soviet bloc. And there was they give it a fucking good go to make a Soviet culture. And I'm like, Soviet cinema, Eisenstein, what's the old joke? The best thing the Soviets did was the worst thing the Soviets did was give Ayn Rand an education. Like it's not, they had one hell of a cultural output. I mean, it's why directors love to work, because you had less hassle than you would have had working in the sort of for the 50s and getting strung up by McCarthyites. In terms of the question of subjectivity, though, in terms of sovereignty, just to bring your point up, Nate, I think the real difficulty of this is that's the thing, we're dealing with non-knowledge here. Bataille is trying to talk about, these are notes towards a theory of non-knowledge. At least these aren't his only notes. There's a collection of notes and texts put together by Stuart Kendall called The Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge. I don't think I'm ever going to assign any of it. There's a great section of it, to be honest. There's a good section where it's a multiple conversation between I think it might be Desjardins as well, isn't there? But I think Kojev's there, Hippolyte's there, Sartre are there, and they're all having a big conversation of dialectics together. But the sovereign moment for the subject is not, it's going to be the annihilation of the subject, but only in the sense of the subject as it is not language, discourse, and social meaning. There we go. Insofar as it's understandable through language, discourse, and social meaning. I haven't touched this thing. Why is it doing that? So the annihilation of subjectivity, and this is what he's going to get to in Inner Experience, is going to be ultimately this rupture of the subject in the moment, which is not describable to it in knowable terms. Similar to religious experience. It's going to be this ecstasy, which is both happening for the subject, so happening for everyone else at the same time. Well, it could be, but just for them, it's only happening for them in that moment. And then secondly, it's not reportable back in terms of here's a scientific experience broken down into all of these. And but writing it down, making notes about these kind of experiences is really the tension, the heart of what Bataille is doing here, which is why he's looking at these moments negatively, in terms of where they've been and what festivals are around them, and sort of the whole left by these moments, rather than seeing, finding a subject and going, "Excuse me, are you sovereign?" And they go, "Yes." And it's like, well, fuck, you've just spoken a word. Now you're no longer sovereign because we're now in the realm of discourse. God damn this.
So to pick up on Adam's point about culture and communism, what's interesting is if you look at the earliest points of the Russian Revolution, some of the leaders of the Russian Revolution were the constructivists and subsequently the supremists, who were probably the most abstract artists ever. I mean, the supremist Malevich, he's the guy who did White on White. Basically the end of art. And they were ultimately crushed by the communists, who wanted more realistic art. They did not want this notion of a sacred, and ultimately that then results in Dadaism, because up until the point of the supremists, you had this notion that culture could be a driver of social good and social change, and that was ultimately destroyed and resulted in Dadaism. To get back to Aisha's point, and I think Chris's point and Nate's point, is the confusion over the subjective. What I think Bataille is saying is that once the subject emerges, the subject is immediately bound by guilt and prohibition. And that's what drives them. So transgression is the means. Transgression is not the ends. Transgression is the means to experiencing guilt. And that's ultimately where you're going to get to, because animals don't have guilt. When the coyote kills the rabbit outside my house, he has no guilt over it. And for some reason, you get back to basic psychoanalysis. We have the drive to be bad. We have the drive to be punished. And that's inherent. Bataille seems to be saying that's inherent in our subjectivity. And then, so if you take that all the way to like a Buddhist notion, is that subjectivity in and of itself is a means or a place in the evolution of the self. And the Buddhists would say you need to get to the non-self, because once you not transgress, but move beyond the subjective and become the non-self, that's when you'll gain the ability to have enlightenment and understanding. But as long as you're subject, what bounds you to rationality is not your subjective ability to act, but your ability to constrain yourself from acting. And that is unnatural. And that's where guilt comes from. And that's why pure subjectivity is not the end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of the question for me is that what Bataille is kind of showing us here, at least in terms of this distinction in his discussion about communism and his kind of contrasting it with the bourgeois mode of being and everything, is that kind of in both cases, let's not even call it the subject necessarily, let's call it the subject in this case, but this human being or whatever, this thing that Bataille is sort of trying to liberate from a kind of dependence on the world of things. In one case, in the bourgeois world, ends up basically becoming totally dependent on and enslaved by things in terms of sort of pursuing sovereignty through the accumulation of commodities or whatever. And then in the communist world, you see the subject literally become an object, because it literally just basically becomes, the means of production for further, growth and accumulation of the collective means of production. And so one thing that I find really interesting about this is that, he's so sort of intent on pushing this notion of the sacred and the sovereign moment and everything, because it is in fact this moment of sort of non-utility and a kind of liberation from this, this dialectic of kind of domination and subjugation into kind of a space of true freedom, but not in the sense of a freedom that comes about through, dominating others and working on others necessarily, but in a kind of freedom that comes with just letting things be as they are, and kind of allowing oneself to just escape from that sort of discursive mode that seeks to know and rationalize and categorize everything. So yeah, I think that as we, John, you always kind of bring it back to a Sufi mysticism or kind of a Buddhist notions. And I think that I was reading some Stuart Kendall this morning and talking about, Bataille's, quest to kind of become a monk, and there's a longing for these religious experiences that never quite came to him, that he kind of started finding in other means, like art and kind of these other sort of experiments with desubjectification. I think that kind of stuff is super, super interesting to kind of explore and sort of addressing these questions.
I wonder, Nate, just to respond to you, if the reason why it can't come into fruition is that, in my understanding, Sufism is both transgressive and also is not centered around transgression. It doesn't hold, and it's hard the transgressive mode as the mode of coming into being necessarily. It assumes a certain position relative or vis-a-vis God, or possibility vis-a-vis God, and doesn't necessarily emphasize again and again that I am transgressing. And I wonder if that's what's different in Bataille. Just to respond is that transgression is the subjectivity of the vehicle through which this happens. And, you know, John, you and I can talk separately, but there's plenty of literature that is about how precisely in Islam, and particularly amongst amongst Sufism, within Sufism and Sufi thinkers, Sufis, this concept of guilt is precisely what's done away with, right? That and that's precisely the motor of what enables that relationship, is that guilt goes away. And here, if we're saying that there's a closeness with psychoanalysis, that guilt is in the transgression, because there's no transgression that isn't already a moral category. Like, I can't imagine, not just for Bataille, ever, like when is transgression ever outside of a moral frame? It can be a means through which maybe you arrive at a certain kind of subjectivity where you've, through that's his whole mode, right? Excess as, then throw away, and then somehow you've arrived at, through that act, some kind of purification, or some kind of removal of a burden has taken place through the transgressive act. In psychoanalysis, it's the opposite. Yes, guilt is in my reading at least, the motor of, you know, Freud's conception of civilization, but so too is repression. And because of guilt, repression, and I think, like, it feels like Bataille is pushing against that. It's like the inverted relation. Those were both comments, but the thing that I really wanted to respond to really wanted to raise again is around temporality, which is this perhaps why freedom can only be moments for Bataille? Like, is there an actual outside of the bind? I don't know. That's it. He does keep talking about moments of freedom. You know, yeah.
Yeah, that's what he ends with. He ends with the beer. He ends with that you choose not to go back to work, then have a beer instead. And you have that moment of freedom. That's why I think his project ultimately is incomplete. He doesn't get there. He cannot get beyond, you know, the Lacanian lack. You can do all of this stuff, but you're going to have a lack. So I think where he ultimately gets to is you take this full circle all the way back to the beginning, which is, we're going to have this excess. What are we going to do with this excess? And, you know, he's going to conclude that there are a lot of good ways to use this excess. But if you look how we're using the excess today, the United States is giving billions of dollars of armament to Ukraine and Israel today because we have all these excess bombs and stuff. So we create war to get rid of our excess. And what he said at the beginning is, no, let's have a big party to get rid of our excess, as opposed to building bombs and using those bombs. But I don't think he has an answer. He doesn't get to an end. And that's why he's going to turn to Nietzsche. And I don't think Nietzsche is going to get him there either. He's he's identifying a problem. It's very like Foucault. He identifies a problem without an answer. And then the one last thing I think, because there was one session I didn't attend, but I thought he had a great point about, he fully acknowledges his sources he relies upon are crap historically. Factually, they're crap. But he says that's not the point. The point is, this is what people were thinking at the time. So we need what it matters more, the story being told, than the story is true, because the story as told is going to influence and impact the habit of the people more than what actually happened. And so he's looking for ways. I think through this whole book, he has looked through so many ways to organize a society and come up to a notion of an individual and collective good. You know, the notion that your identity is equally internal as it is external. Your identity as a person is driven by your reaction to your milieu, and your milieu is enacted to yourself. And I think he's getting through that, but does not have a final answer other than, as Aisha said, that moment of sovereignty when you have a beer rather than go back to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think this problem that Aisha brings up of like transgression and everything is really useful to think about, I think, through the lens of Nietzsche. And I think that's maybe why we get there next. And I'm really excited for that chapter as well, because how Nietzsche, and especially like in Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, you know, talks about, you know, humanity as like a completely reactive species. And a transgression in that sense is like also a completely reactive move. It's not at all sort of, you know, self-posited. It's, you know, completely in reaction to an object, and by definition then isn't really sovereign. And so, you know, I don't know a ton about Sufism. I've read some about it, but I don't know a lot about it. But I really admire it, but I'm looking at this kind of through the lens of like Taoism, which is something that I've read a lot more of. And, you know, and they sort of really posit sort of a new sort of way of relating to things, to actions. And I think that one way I guess I could illustrate this through Bataille is his discussion of the emergence of sort of value judgments, which I kind of thought to be one of the more interesting aspects of this whole chapter. Because he says that these sort of value judgments basically spring forth out of, you know, effective moments of repugnance or sympathy towards one thing or another that then become like hypothesized into these value distinctions that then become the basis for, you know, strata. So like classes, ranks, etc. And it's precisely like this movement of, you know, hypothesizing an affect and turning it into a rational category that sort of is the sort of negative reactive human moment that, you know, stultifies, you know, the flow of an indeterminate kind of time that isn't sort of subjected to these notions of present, future, and past, you know, this kind of linear time, more sort of like aeonic time, to like put it, I guess, in like Deleuzian terms. I guess I kind of lost where I'm going with that, but that was just something that I was thinking about, that what you said got me thinking about.
One thing you could throw out is that the rest of the world has it right and Western Europe has it wrong. And Adam will always love this because it's all Kant's fault. Kant identified the individual. He created the unique individual. Then that individual has rationality, and that has become a fundamental problem that doesn't exist in so many other cultures, because other cultures identify, you know, look at they have a non-self, or they have a self as identified through their milieu, but they don't have this drive to individuality and this drive to see your subjectiveness as distinct and unique from the milieu you're in. And so when you quote Sufism, Buddhism, Taoism, or even, you know, any other type of faith, or, you know, what Ubuntu or anything like that, you don't have this fixation on you as a distinct, unique identity that is distinct and unique from your society. Very anti Spinoza's notion of there is one substance and we are all part of that substance, and we're not unique or distinct from any other. That person next to you is part of you is a very, very accepted notion in cultures outside Western Europe. But in Western Europe, we are unique and we are whole. And so our identity comes from our wholeness, as opposed to what you're seeing now being developed in biology, is that down to one cell organisms, those one cell organisms have their own consciousness. And as they combine, they share that consciousness. And that consciousness becomes a shared consciousness that eventually becomes a body. And you get to Deleuze's notion of multiplicity, is that you are not unique. You are billions and billions and billions of consciousnesses that are shared to act collectively for themselves. So the human body is the perfect communist system. And Kant just destroyed all of that. And we're going to spend the rest of our lives in Western Europe digging out of that unique identity.
It is all Kant's fault. It is actually Kant's fault. Am I going to punch this thing again? Right, cool.
No. Now the problem is we can hear you, but you're like a muffled little version of yourself.
How about now? I was testing whether or not I've been short-circuiting it. Okay.
Not better.
Interesting, isn't it? Interesting.
It feels like it's a different mic that's picking it up almost.
What would happen if you didn't have the gear?
Okay. Okay, I switched it to the microphone. Okay, yes, I absolutely agree with Johnny. It is entirely Kant's fault because Kant gives us a transcendental subject, which one isn't us, but is two based on German property relations, which is based on Roman legal codes, and then expanded to the entire system of the possibility of experience, which is then carried across throughout pretty much. I mean, Kant. There's a brilliant example, research by a guy called Robert Bernasconi, who writes this text. Did Kant invent the concept of race? And he cites this text by Kant, which is called On Teleological Principles. So it's called On the Use of Teleological Principles in Philosophy. And it's one of the papers he writes before the first critique. And he says, basically, we need to do critique of pure reason to establish the validity of certain anthropological categories. And what's the category that Kant gives as a teleological principle that justifies the entire critique of pure reason? It's racism. It's not even some kind of, you can't even do a conservative scare about this. Kant's literally, we need to do the critique of pure reason. Why? So we can be racist. He says it as clear as that. And it's this individualization, which really is what's so refreshing about Bataille insofar as he thinks about things energetically and then more diffuse. And it's why, individuals are discontinuous being rather than continuous being. There's not a continuum individuality, rather it's always an interruption of it. And no, I just wanted to pick up what John was saying there. I know we haven't got a super long amount of time left. We could give Foucault guys a little bit of time to set up. Not too much, of course. We can take a bit of excess there. But there's one distinction I think we haven't quite covered today, which I thought was interesting, which is the distinction between power and sovereignty, which I found really interesting because, for example, 357, there's a quote in section 9. It says that he who exercises supreme power in its objectivity aims in any case to put an end to sovereignty's dominion over things. Things must be freed from any particular subordination. Henceforth, they must be subordinate only to undifferentiated man. In this respect, the man who wields his power, who deliberately deprives himself of the enjoyment of those things that he administers, as if the things administered themselves, is the equal of the sovereign whom his predecessors dethroned. I just think it's very interesting to see that sovereignty and power have been set aside. I mean, if you think about, for example,
going to 352 to section 60, objectivity of power. Since it is human, power is the refusal of sovereignty. In the same way, a man who decides not to light his lamp refuses to light. He who possesses and serves things by developing them enjoys a greater and greater power, but he doesn't make use of it. He is not subordinated to anyone else, in the sense that no one else possesses it, in the service of whom he would be placed. He has sovereignty in principle, but he replaces it with the objectivity of power. And here we see a development of the idea of renunciation of sovereignty. Because if one renounces sovereignty on behalf of serving power, in a way which you serve power by essentially serving institutions by renouncing the sovereign moment in fate, and if you can only renounce a moment in the moment of renouncing it, and therefore there's a sovereign renunciation there. And I think it's interesting passing sovereignty against power, because we'd want to think that power is sovereignty. You think that power is, for example, the power of the king is his sovereignty. But for Bataille, it seems to be the complete opposite. Sovereignty is kind of what the king can do as what the power might enable the king to do in the moment, but the institution itself is fully against sovereignty. Because if anything, the king is kind of just I mean, the sovereignty of the king is actually kind of against his position of power as a king, because he's just sitting there. I mean, you think about some of the sovereign power of, for example, like democratic representatives, and how, if anything, you look at some democratic representatives and you see the institution of power has completely devoured them, and you feel kind of sad. Like, I mean, yeah, poor, yeah, not poor these people, but thinking about sort of the more gerontocratic aspects of, for example, like particularly like US and UK. You see like some of these older senators who are their institution and they're sort of their staffers are more or less like piloting them like zombies into the depth of oblivion, like Dianne Feinstein, or even to some extent Joe Biden, like the kind of elder abuse that you can see in manifest in institutions. That man has no, that man formally is meant to have sovereignty in terms of like executive order, but power-wise, these people are like 10 staffers in the trench coat, and you almost feel sorry for them. You shouldn't, but yeah, they knew what they were doing into. But you can sort of see this distinction manifesting in a kind of a comedy of power, where you think power emboldens your sovereignty, but actually captures you within what Bataille talks a lot about, which is the office of power, which is why the king is kind of an embarrassment to not only power itself, but his own sovereignty.
No, I think you're absolutely right that there is a fundamental distinction between power and sovereignty. And to take it back to Foucault, resistance always precedes power. Power, and you see that everywhere. So to have power is not to have sovereignty. Power it exists to repress and hold down resistance. A perfect example of that is shoot a jet engine in a vacuum. It's not going to go anywhere because there is no resistance. So power is pointless. So what Bataille is saying is that sovereignty is something much more nebulous or distinct than power. An autocrat is not seen by the people as their sovereign. Because they're not acting against him because they just don't want to be killed. The sovereign is more of the Hume notion of habit. We'll accept this person as our sovereign, and that's why Adam's pointing out of Joe Biden is a perfect example. Joe Biden is the perfect example of a sovereign because the 80% of the American population do not believe he's competent for the job. And nor do they care, unlike other administrations where, like, I remember we had Reagan, people liked the people behind Reagan and knew the people behind Reagan and said, oh, those people have good ideas. Reagan is a buffoon. No one really talks about who's behind Biden. It's just, we are seeing this person as our king. And it's no different than, going back to the Middle Ages where you had child kings. We're going to recognize this person as sovereign, even though we know they're incapable of making rational decisions. So I think Adam's hit on a real important point, and that's an important point that probably needs to be developed more in our discussion of Bataille, is this distinction between power and sovereignty, because they're not necessarily related in any way.
I am really glad that we came back to this, because this was one of the questions that I had. And on page 356, maybe this is something you'd already referenced, Adam and John, but just at the beginning of section 9, the second sentence, he says, sovereignty often entails power, but then it is sovereignty that is power's end. And I feel like in this criticism of Soviet communism, Bataille feels like sovereignty has been subordinated to power and maybe lost or attempted to be erased. And perhaps in contrast to the power that traps democratic bourgeois capitalist system politicians, we can think about the Aztecs, which in the historical data chapter seem to be one of the societies that Bataille most seem to admire, and that's where power is unquestionably in the service of sovereignty, that they can raise pyramids and sacrifice their slaves, that there's maybe something for Bataille more human, more spiritual, more sacred or sovereign in that subordination of power only to sovereign excess, rather than being trapped in the objectivity of power.
I wouldn't say it's more human, just. I think there's definitely a sense in which it's more explicit about the dynamics that's going on. But I think in terms of like the access of sovereignty, in terms of like the stuff we can consume and waste, more than ever before. I think what's so fascinating about is the fact that we haven't. Like the bourgeois has a kind of sovereignty in the class distinction in so far to be like, okay, we can, give some modest gifts, but we're a bit too constrained by Protestantism. Whereas communism is all about making so much more of the stuff. That means we could have festivals all the time if we're productive, the style they're saying we're having, we could have sovereignty up the arse. It is everywhere. I mean, thinking about the debates that Khrushchev and Nixon were having, the kitchen debates, when they literally just modeled the kitchen, and we wouldn't have this now. We wouldn't have like Xi Jinping and Joe Biden debating about the merits of their respective systems on like Saturday Night Live or something. They wouldn't have it being like, we Austin would have this and Austin would have that. We wouldn't have that anymore. But I think for Bataille, I think for Bataille was actually one of the most human things, in the sense of it's never before has humanity managed to renounce its own sovereignty so extensively. Which who else could do that? What else could do that? Because not only if humanity is renunciation of the given, if it has the capacity to give itself the capacity for these sovereign moments and then doesn't, that's the fascinating thing. Because it requires this sort of transvaluation of. I think whilst Bataille can definitely be a bit more sort of noble savage, I think, but in terms of a slightly more charitable, I think it's more explicit case of the Aztecs in terms of that's why it's so good as data. But I think what's so fascinating with him about the Soviets is that they could, but they're still. And if we can go back to Volume 1, where it's like, these guys ain't going to stop. They might accidentally cause a nuclear war, but at least the Americans are so scared of them, they might, accidentally do some sovereignty and, do a Marshall Plan every other war or so.
So, great. I guess my question would be, because I'm now stacking Nate's comment on Nietzsche's critique of reaction or reactionary with Foucault, the comment on Foucault and power and resistance, and thinking about power and sovereignty together. Like if we take the Nietzschean route, then power and sovereignty are in a reactive. And that makes sense to me, a relation also, meaning that then power might be understood as those moments of transgression, which include excess. Excess is a transgression for him, right? So that's a question is, what is a form of power? What forms does it take? He only gives us certain kinds of examples, but if non-knowledge is the ultimate end, I assume that too, non-knowledge is power, but I don't get all that much of a sense, except to imagine that in these moments of sovereignty, there's some moment where one is not determined by anything. That could be the moment of power also. But that is also very different then, where that then gives us iterations of what, or multiple forms that power can take. Now, if we take the power resistance thing, you know, I had a conversation, John, I was thinking about you and Will, because we asked that question about whether resistance precedes. And I think I was of the thinking that it must, but I wonder if what Foucault's saying is that we cannot have an instance of power without at the same time and in the same moment that we are talking about power, what's instantiated is also resistance. Like it's internal as opposed to power, that resistance is within, that power cannot exist without it. So the question of its temporality then, as a prior, I'm not sure. So I was just rethinking that a little bit when we were having this conversation right now, that like, is there a temporality here between sovereignty and then power? If it's reaction, yes. If there are moments of twinning or like, I don't know how to describe it, of duality, then maybe no. But yeah.
Well, let's look at it in a Nietzschean sense, that power is always going to be reactive, because it's force against resistance. And that's where I would, question Chris's comment about whether the Aztecs had the ultimate power, not if the action was through sovereignty, because they chose to build the pyramids. It wasn't a reactive response. I need to do this or I'll be killed. I don't want to build the pyramid. And that would, Nietzsche would say, no, you're not, that's a reactive response. But action in response to sovereignty is always going to be an active response, because it's a shared goal. You are doing it because you want to do it, not because you're under power, not because you're under power and you're resistant, you give on your resistance to do the act.
This is kind of the problem with the ambiguity of power here, and particularly when it's always left under sort of objectivity. So when we think about for Foucault, it's always so kind of diffuse. You're always tempted to think about it in energetic terms, and I can hear Will screaming at me from Long Island, placing any kind of Foucault under any kind of definitional rubric that might even lend it to energetics. But I mean, this is why it's the frustration, particularly of the very note-like structure of these. I mean, the objectivity of power, which we'd think would take, quite a long time, is phrased as as basically a subtitle, and it's I mean, it's pretty something there. We must now see the relation of the objectivity of power and sovereignty. So long as power is an individual end, it is only really the means of which sovereignty is the individual end. And so it does become essentially the empowerment. Basically, power becomes a kind of utility maxing. But the problem is that the utility at the end of it is sovereignty, the non-utile. And this is going to be the constant struggle Bataille acknowledges, and we're going to be in every book Bataille does, is talking about something which language is insufficient to talk about, knowing something which is inherently against the structures which make knowledge possible, because knowledge is always stretched out between means and ends, and escaping the very dark means and ends, but talking about it through means. This is the kind of the dance, the meta stability, and even maybe we can even talk about this whole. We've talked about everything in terms of a real struggle in Bataille's early career, because when we spoke, I spoke earlier about that everyone wants to be, everyone wants fertilized, no one wants to shit. We can think about it in terms of Bataille tried to form a community with Asafal, and it was based on human sacrifice. Everyone wanted to be sacrificed, no one wanted to be the executioner. No one wanted to do the transcript. No one wanted to have that sovereign moment, and we can see this tension really going throughout the entirety of Bataille's corpus. And this is where I think, just sort of, I guess, to round off to some extent, this is where Nietzsche is going to be so interesting. This is why we have 2 sessions left. So and the second, next session we're going to look at what I'm calling Nietzsche, Christ, and Communism. So it's a part 4, sections 1, which is Nietzsche and communism, and 2, Nietzsche and Jesus. And put a bit of secondary on there. It's like literally just 1-2 pages of on Nietzsche, because Bataille's Nietzsche, we're going to get more of it from this, from this section than otherwise. And then the final one, just gonna polish off the rest of it instead of Nietzsche or communism. And then I just wanted to put a little bit in there about Nietzsche's thinking about the state, from Nussberg Zarathustra's New Idol, and then Stuart Kendall for any, that episode, which I really wish I was on, couldn't make it, but that Stuart Kendall episode was probably rarely quite definitive in terms of what anything we can get out of Bataille. But I think we should probably give the Foucauldians a little bit of warm up time. Here, we'll go to the Foucault group some time for a quick bathroom and sovereign beer break. I just want to say to everyone, thanks for coming again. It's always good session as always.
Yeah, awesome stuff, guys.
We know it's a good session because my microphone tends to short out the most at these ones, and I'm going to have some technical wizardry go over this and fix it, but probably not by next session, knowing how things go here. But anyway, everyone, thank you so much again.
Yeah,
awesome session. I'm going to
See y'all
stop
in a month.
recording now.
Yeah.
We'll see you all next time.